Hey, all. Welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Padgett, a AM950 Radio edition today. Back at it. Sorry, I've been gone for so long off the podcast, off on the Vote Common Good tour. But I'm back. I've been back for a week. Going to get my life back. Going to be a little bit of a break again. On again, off again. It's a podcast schedule here for the next couple of weeks because I need a little vacation. So over the Thanksgiving holiday week, I'm going to be away, as they say. And we'll be back. So thank you for being part of the podcast. And I look forward to seeing all of you that are going to be at the WITH conference in Denver this week or at the Red Letter Revival this weekend down in Dallas. So you can find that over on my Facebook page and other places at the withcollective.org and redletterchristians.org. All right, so here's the show from today, a Veterans Day edition of AM950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, 4 o'clock radio show with Doug Padgett on Now We're Talking with Doug Padgett. Is that confusing enough? Well, you figured it out just by subscribing to the podcast. Well done. Hey, good afternoon, AM950, 4 o'clock hour, 4:06. On a day where I feel like I could say January 3rd today with that weather outside. I went for a little walk, Brett, outside, and I wish everyone would, especially these late afternoons when the sun is still out. Did you get frostbite? I did. My face was, I
have to embellish. Everyone always gets all paranoid when it gets to 20 degrees in November. It's the end of the world.
I kind of felt that way. I think I should be putting some Vaseline on my cheeks. I think I'm going to get windburn. So cold. I tried to take a phone call and couldn't talk. I felt like I'd been at the dentist. My mouth and face was frozen. It is just wintry. Mm-hmm. And I know this isn't the way, that a person of kindness thinks, but I was thinking, boy, it is better than those Santa Ana winds in California that are causing all those fires, though. That was my one moment of like, well, maybe this wind chill of whatever it is, 5 below out there, is better than, the damage that can come from those winds. Have you been following those fires out in California and what they're saying is causing them?
Yeah, I actually used to live out there as a kid, so we still have some friends and neighbors. Yeah, they actually live in the Santa Barbara, Thousand Oaks area. So yeah, they've been evacuated. It's tough out there.
Yeah, they're saying that basically, like contrary to what the President of the United States tweeted about, that it's just forest mismanagement. The wind is so dry, so hot because of the speed of the wind, that it's just causing fire to explode in places where they never thought you would have fires. Like it is truly being caused. Both of these fires that are burning right now, the Camp Fire and I can't remember the name they gave the other fire. They're both burning the way they are, according to people who study this in California, because the climate, the wind, and the dry conditions are so intense. There's just nothing you can do about it. I mean, that's a reality for the human experience in lots of places in the world, that nature has its own storyline going on, right? That those winds are just hot enough and strong enough to take any little ember and turn it into just a raging inferno. Really.
You just got to think how seriously people need to take that out there, because that's only going to become more frequent as time goes on. And if you're building a house out there, and you're thinking, is it going to burn down because of these wildfires?
It's really
unreal
something.
With climate change.
An entire town of thousands of people, that little Paradise, California, one of those little valley towns, they're not huge anyway. They're meant to be sort of, Sierra towns, in the lower Sierras. The whole town is gone. It's just apocalyptic sounding, that you could lose an entire town in a fire like that. Unbelievable. So, thoughts go out there. And hey, I went to the post office today to mail something, me and about 7 other people at the time I was standing in using the self-service kiosk, and was then again reminded that today is the observance of Veterans Day. Veterans Day confused me this year, right? It was yesterday, I think, but then I think it's observed today. Is Veterans Day a day that moves around? Is it a date on the calendar and not a day?
I don't think it does, because I think one of the callers on the previous show said, I think that's where the saying, the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month. That's where that comes from. So I think Veterans Day is on the 11th every year, but we're just observing it on a Monday because it's a weekday.
Okay, so that's what I'm getting at, because that's what I remember too, the 11/11/11, on the 11th month, 11th day at 11 a.m. So then we commemorate Veterans Day on a different day of the week each year, depending on what day of the week the 11th falls.
I guess it's similar to like 4th of July, where if the 4th of July is like on a Sunday, then you would observe it on a Monday, where a lot of government offices are closed on the 5th. Like if the 4th is on a Sunday.
Yeah, well, that's why I threw everybody off at the post office today. Or if somebody's been waiting for that package to be delivered, you're not getting it today. And a little list: some banks are open, some banks are closed. I mean, it's a little late in the day for that. I guess most banks would be closed by now. Anyway, at this time of the day. But yeah, that's it's a big holiday. And I've got a little thought about this. Somebody posted a really great piece that I saw on the internet in a little article called "The Meaning of Armistice Day." And here's what I think is interesting about this. From the end of the war of 1918, so one of the big reasons that Veterans Day is getting a lot of attention this year is because it's a 100-year commemoration. And from that day on, the recognition of the signing of the armistice, or of the end of the war, the essential end of the war, the peace treaty for World War I, was a day that was celebrated in the United States as Armistice Day, as Peace Day, until 1954. And you might know that the World War I is often, we now refer to as World War I, used to just be called the Great War, or sometimes referred to as the war to end all wars. Well, all the way through the end of that war in 1918 until 1954, Armistice Day was celebrated as a hallowed anniversary of the day that the world had decided to end war. So its notion of armistice was a day of peace and a day of non-war. Well, in 1954, after the effects of what became the Second War, or what some people call the continuation of World War I, but we would call World War II, and other military action, and the Korean War, it became clear that you could no longer celebrate a day as a day of peace. So the day then was repurposed and called Veterans Day. Well, there's a group of people, including a group called Veterans for Peace. They're an anti-war group who wants to reclaim Armistice Day. And essentially their argument is we should have two separate days. We should have a day that is the Armistice Day, where we celebrate non-militarism and we celebrate peace. And then we should have a day where we commemorate veterans. Their point being, we shouldn't conflate those two together, because and this is an interesting argument. In one sense, when you recognize veterans, you're doing a thing that our nation wants to do, which is to say we appreciate, we respect, we honor the fact that you gave yourself into military service. But by default, you're cheering on, by these people's suggestion, and I agree with them, you're commemorating the value of the military. So for the non-military people, they would like a day, and Armistice Day could be that day, where you're making the argument for peace and against war, and you're not making commentary about those who've been conscripted into war or chose to volunteer to be part of a war apparatus, but you're just honoring the notion of the day of peace and the day when wars end. And I think that's a really interesting notion, that in our society, we have chosen to take a day that was set aside for peace and to remember how much better the world is when we have peace between countries rather than animosity and violence and war. And that day has then turned into a day when we honor our war veterans by renaming it in 1954 Veterans Day. So Kurt Vonnegut, in his book in 1973 called The Breakfast of Champions, which is where some of this comes from, he argues that Armistice Day was a sacred day, but Veterans Day is not. Veterans for Peace, this group says, want to reclaim it, arguing that the day was originally meant to celebrate peace and not militarism. Armistice Day was a hallowed anniversary because it was supposed to protect future life from wars. Veterans Day instead celebrates heroes And some would argue their great sacrifice that they gave and the importance of that. It also goes on to encourage others to dream of playing the hero themselves, covering themselves in war value and war valor. It's just a really interesting notion that we have such a hard time knowing what to do with our constant war footing that the United States has been on since World War II, and how we have utilized our government funding to support wars and to support violence all around the world. On this other hand, we see ourselves as people of peace. We see ourselves as people of protection, right? When we think about our veterans, we don't think about them in terms of them being a part of war. We think about them being the ones that protect us and that keep us safe. And that's the narrative. But the two sort of sit uncomfortably next to each other. The desire for demilitarization of the planet, and yet the honoring and the valuing of those who, in the current set of conditions in which war is our norm, are choosing to offer themselves to be part of it. It's a really, I think, a curious place. So I'm interested in people who have thoughts on this to give us a call over here today. Talk about a little bit about Armistice Day, Veterans Day for the first half of the show. If you're interested, 952-946-6205. If you're new to the calling, if you don't already have that in your Fave 5, it's 952-946-6205. And I remember growing up, and Brett, I don't know what you heard in school, but I remember hearing about Armistice Day, and maybe it's because, I don't know, like the switch to Veterans Day, it only happened, I don't know, like in the 50s, and I was coming of age in the 70s, so that was sort of new enough that I think people still referred to it as Armistice Day. And World War I was still somewhat something that people had enough memory about, like their grandparents had been in that war and it was sort of around. But I haven't heard anything about Armistice Day, feels like, in the last 10 or 15 years at all. And why Veterans Day is celebrated on the 11/11 date. Do you have any memory of that? Was that part of your childhood at all, or your civic upbringing?
I pretty much only remember Veterans Day. I mean, I have heard of Armistice Day, but not really so much. Not really about that. No, it's more I've heard about Veterans Day. And you were talking about too how a lot of times we, kind of forget about World War I, or we have as time goes on. I definitely agree with that, because certainly people always talk about World War II, the Civil War, but yes, World War I kind of gets forgotten, and it of course had a huge impact on history, not just in the United States, but all over the world, Europe, everywhere.
Oh yeah, it's the thing. In fact, so much of our current modern day crisis around the world of country versus country roots itself back to the reorganizing of parts of the Middle East and Africa and Europe after World War I, when people got together and just decided that they were going to make nations out of ethnic groups, and there was an entire movement that was happening there. So anyway, we can talk about that when we come back here after the break. But if you want to be on this chat, I'd love to hear about your thoughts on World War I, Armistice Day, and Veterans Day, of course. 952-946-6205 is the number. We'll be back here after the break. Hey, welcome back now. Hey, a great pick there, Brett. That's a song a lot of people use as one of those sort of anthems that Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA. It was actually a bit of a dirge sung about the effects of the Vietnam War on people's lives. When you listen to that, when you listen all the way through to the lyrics of that song, you realize it's trying to make a point about the brutality of how we treat people who come back from our wars. That especially Vietnam, when there was when people were put into the army and put into danger and put into life-threatening situations against their will via a draft. It's a real problem. Hey, so and by the way, the President of the United States, I know that Matt talked a bit about this. I just want to get my 2 cents in, Matt, in the last hour. That for Donald Trump going to France, I'm understanding going to France, particularly because of the Armistice celebration, the 100 years, that the president went and was supposed to go to memorials to commemorate the Americans who died in the war, in the Great War, then chose not to go because he would have to drive in a car for a long time because of the weather, and it was going to be raining, and apparently that would not look good on him and maybe even affect his hair. which is one of the new pieces of reporting I heard this morning on that. Just shows that once again we don't have a president in this country the way that we used to. We are having to function with the lack of a presidency, and I know that that's the point for a lot of the small government conservatives. I have a number of friends that hold this position. They've argued for a long time that the problem is we have too powerful of a presidency, and we need to have a smaller presidency. And their point that they're trying to drive home is that they want a presidency with less power to it. Well, you got that now. You've got it where the person, not that we've constitutionally limited the presidency, but we have degraded it to the point that the person who's in it basically doesn't do the job. He doesn't function as a president in any sense that we've all been comfortable with. On the other hand, he's a wrecking ball of an administration. So what we have, in my view, is a dangerous administration lacking a president. And that's why so many of us are finding ourselves just losing our minds. And when you hear people who support this presidency the way that they do, they'll often argue that that's what they like about it. In other words, they'll say, I don't really like Donald Trump, and I don't like the way he talks, and I don't like the way he acts, and I don't like the way he behaves. The him-ness, the person-ness of the presidency I don't like. What I do like are the policies that the administration is putting out. Now, I would argue the policies are equally as damaging, and I think that they're horrible for this country. I think they're horrible for the planet. I think they're horrible for people around the world. But basically what they're arguing is it's good that we have just an administration that puts forth these policies, even if we have somebody who's not really functioning in any way, shape, or form in the way that we could honor and be proud of having a president. And this notion that Republicans have become comfortable with, and that a lot of libertarians and a lot of libertarian conservatives are comfortable with, that we want to downgrade the role of the presidency, but keep its executive function as setting the administrative agenda on policy and on cabinet positions, is, I think, a nightmare scenario. I think it's the worst possible way that this thing could go. I think it's a real problem because this country, like it or not, has become comfortable with the idea that we actually have a person that we elect to be in that office, and that the person in the office is what we depend on. And we want to trust the person. If we want to go to some parliamentary system, which is essentially what people are arguing for, where it doesn't really matter who the prime minister is in a parliamentary system, the person can swap in or out, that the government is what we elect, and the government is some kind of coalition, but the prime minister is the head, does not really have the power of the presidency. If that's the thing people want in this country, this is what it would look like. Sort of a front man to the band with no real talent, no real contribution to the music, and is just sort of the front to the whole thing. I think it's disastrous. So what we have is an administration that doesn't have a president, but it's just unleashing policy like crazy that is hazardous to the country. And I think this is what's sitting, I think, at the heart of the crisis for people wondering how to think about this presidency, because we're torn. That it's not sufficient for any of us to say he's just bad at his job. You don't have the luxury of being bad at your job in our current political system. It does damage when you're just bad at your job. So in other words, when you don't fulfill international obligations to be a person of peace, it's bad for the country. When you don't speak about care for the country during mass shootings, it's bad for the country. When you blame forest administrators for major devastating natural disaster fires that are happening in California. I mean, these are just the things that are happening in the last week. When you lack the person in that role, the country then has to recalibrate and say we don't have a person in that role any longer because it's really a problem. Hey, Jeff from Minneapolis, you've got a couple thoughts about this, about Trump's approach to shaking up the system, as some of the people who support him like to say?
Yeah, I echo your words. I mean, you really hit home with me because I have family members that are strong Trump supporters, and I'm very liberal and progressive in my viewpoints. And the common thread here is what you're saying is that we love Trump, even though, he does obnoxious things and We don't really like him as a person, but he's shaking up mainstream Washington, and he's bringing down, the traditional old guard system. And I just find that so odd that, people would like to, see somebody that has so much hatred, so much bitterness, so much bringing this, this country, separating this country. We're so divided. We're a house divided.
Yeah.
And it's because, he's bringing down, he's shaking up the politics. It's not the old school politics. But I said, well, what was wrong with it?
Yeah, right.
And,
right.
You've just hit, I think, the nail squarely on the head with what you're talking about. And I was just listening to you tonight, and I just said, wow, this guy's right on.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. It's I think you've nailed it too. That there's, if you begin with the assumption that we want less of the president, you might be happy with Donald Trump. And this is where the civic argument, where I think in society we could be engaged in better civic conversation that's not political. You can have conversations about the role of government and how we function and how we live, and we should be doing that. In fact, our political system sort of requires that we're going to do that we're going to think about how we organize while we're doing the organizing. We won't just think about it in one period of time in our formation and then move on and execute it. We're going to be supposed to be thinking about it constantly. So we could be having long and healthy and positive conversations of difference in this society about what role do we want the presidency to play? What role do we want the military to play? What role do we want Congress to play? We could be having these very rich conversations. We've tended not to. And even during the Obama years, when you heard, and those of us who were supportive of Obama, like I was, I heard people who weren't supportive of him saying all the time, he runs this imperial presidency. And I've realized that I needed to be pushing back on that notion more strongly, because what I was saying all the time was, no, he's not. There's no kingship going on. Like, I dismissed the argument. But what they were doing by making the argument that Obama was running this imperial presidency and he was above the law was they were trying to make the argument they wanted to downgrade the role of the person in office. Now, I think a lot of that was generated by the philosophical opinion, but I think a lot of it was generated out of racism and personal animosity toward Obama. But what they were doing was making an argument that then they turned around and executed with Donald Trump by saying, we don't care who the person is, all we care is what the policy is. That's the argument that we need to be having in this country, that it does matter who the people are. Our representative form of democracy that developed over the, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, this representative form demands that we care about who the person is, which is why we have ethics rules, which is why we vote for individuals, which is why you can't just swap out one person for the other. And we have a whole plan of succession because the person matters. And I think it's the key to the central understanding of American democracy. Hey, we'll get back here after the break. We got to run into it. Sorry, I ran over there. But if you want to be in this conversation or talk about what's happening on the Minnesota political front, I'm going to talk about Jason Lewis here in a minute. 952-946-6205. We'll be back after the break. Hey, welcome back. 4:35 in the afternoon on this 12th of November of 2018, where some of us are a week into feeling good about the elections that took place on Tuesday. And it looks like things are getting better all around the country for those of us who care about the governorships, senatorial turnouts and races. Could be that Florida and Arizona both end up with Democratic senators instead of Republican senators, which is good news. So one thing we know for sure is that Angie Craig is going to be representing the state of Minnesota, 2nd District, because she defeated Jason Lewis. And Brett, I appreciate you sending over this little article. I noticed it as well, that Jason Lewis is making a complicated argument as to why he lost the election by suggesting that when John McCain voted against repealing the Affordable Care Act, that hamstrung, as I understand his argument, that hamstrung the Republicans so they couldn't put into place the reforms that they would have wanted and would have put in had the repeal have taken place. And that then allowed the Democrats to steal that agenda item about pre-existing condition, turn those into ads, and to run against incumbent Republicans like himself, and that's what caused his loss and the loss of other Republicans to Democratic challengers. Brett? Is that how you read that his rationale or his argument for how he decided to blame John McCain for his own loss?
You pretty much summed it up. That's exactly what he's blaming it on, and it doesn't make any sense to me, because I think if anything, McCain was probably trying to save Republicans by saving Obamacare, because I agree with Matt was saying. If they had repealed Obamacare, they probably would have lost 60 or 70 seats in Congress, not 38 or however many they're going to lose now.
It's just amazing that, first of all, that anybody who loses a congressional race doesn't first off and only take responsibility for it, right? Because it's the most near and dear to the voters of any federally elected position. And for a lot of people in the state, an elected office that voters actually know who their representative is, even though most people don't. But of the people who would know who their representatives are, they know who their congressperson is. And you're really close to the people. So to not take responsibility for it yourself is first and foremost just the most sort of amateurish and classless thing you can do, right? But then to decide that you're going to blame it on some Republican force, some Republican set of conditions, that the Republican circumstance did something that caused you to have to lose. And the thing you pick in November of 2018 is John McCain's decision to not support the overturning of Obamacare. That's the thing you pick. You don't say, I think Donald Trump created a set of conditions that made it impossible for someone like me who supported him to win in this state and in this district. I mean, look, the idea that Angie Craig won with 53% of the vote was primarily because people were motivated by commercials that they saw that brought up the fact that Republicans weren't going to be supporting legislation that saved preconditions on your medical insurance. You might want to say it motivated a very passionate base of people with that argument. You might want to say in a really, really tight race, it moved hundreds of people. Had this been Al Franken's race, when he won statewide by 512 votes, you could say it could have been any but one of these possible issues. But when you lose by like 8 percentage points, and you don't own the fact that the Republican Party's brand is so damaged by Donald Trump, that for Jason Lewis to be like, I was a bad congressperson, which is what he should say first, like the people did not rehire me, that's on me. And then to say, there were conditions on the ground that made it impossible for someone like me to win, and he blames it on John McCain's vote. It is the kind of like weird insider thinking that must go on when you get yourself wrapped up so tight inside of that bubble that you couldn't even see that it was you and your compatriot Donald Trump that caused 53% of people in that district who had previously voted for you as a Republican to now vote for a Democrat. It wasn't caused because of a TV commercials and ads that were pulled about pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, it's unbelievable that he's blaming it on that. And he just must live in such a different world than normal people do. Probably why he was a shock jock when he was in radio, but
yeah, it's just bizarre to me that and look, there's an awful lot of Democrats who do it as well, who want to convince ourselves that what motivated people in this election was the importance of the policies that we know Democrats are going to be better on, right? We want to tell ourselves, no, we cared about healthcare issues. We cared about the environment. We cared about the tax breaks that have been given to the wealthy. We want to tell ourselves that finally people woke up and cared about the issues that we all cared about. We want to tell ourselves that. And Jason Lewis wants to tell himself, I just lost it on the health care and the pre-existing conditions because people came out. And we want to act as if what happened in this 2018 midterm election was, people woke up and they started to care about what happens in politics. And when they cared about what happens in politics, they paid attention to our policy arguments. Look, this thing was motivated. The highest turnout of any midterm election in the history of this country was fueled by the disaster that is the Republican Party led by Donald Trump. Like, if we as Democrats and we as progressives think we've won the policy argument because of this big turnout and because of this wave election and because 100 women are going to represent in Congress and because 333 or 356 legislative seats changed hands and because of all these governorships, if we tell ourselves we won the policy argument, I'm telling you, we're going to get smacked on the spin around on this and act like we didn't see it coming. This election was about Donald Trump. And now we need to take the opportunity to win that argument and then to win the argument of what does it mean to be leaders in the political arena. And Brett, I know I sound like if you listen to this hour of the show when I'm hosting, I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but I want to sound like a broken record on this. It's time for leadership and to win the policy arguments while you're in the party that's in power. This is now the time to don't act like we won the policy argument because we didn't win the policy argument. Look, I know that every congresswoman and every congressman that's won says, I'm glad the people of Minnesota, I'm glad the people of the United States paid attention to our, because that's the right thing to say. But if you start believing that yourself, we're going to be as delusional as Jason Lewis in thinking that what this thing really was a policy referendum. In 8 years of the Obama administration, those of us who are progressive and thought that some of the ideas that were being pushed weren't progressive enough, and some of them were the ones that we liked, we stopped thinking that we had to continue to win the policy argument and thought everything's going to be about turnout. You cannot win by driving the voter base to record level turnouts every election. You have to win the policy arguments during the years when you're in control of setting the policy arguments. And I'm afraid that progressives and I'm afraid that Democrats are not going to do the hard work that we have to do to win the argument because we're going to get distracted by thinking that we already did. Brett, what do you think of that little argument there that I'm on? I'm on a little bit of a tirade a week out from the election as I'm listening to people do the autopsy, or the reconciliation on this. Do you think I'm wrong about this? Because I'd be glad to be wrong. I'd be glad if what happened was people woke up and paid attention to policy and read some policy papers and really paid attention to what was going to happen with the Affordable Care Act if it went away. But my God, I think if people didn't think that was going to happen with Donald Trump when he said he wanted to bring it to an end, and they didn't think that was going to happen when control of the Congress was maintained by Republicans who were promising that with a Republican president they were going to repeal and replace it, I don't think that people caring about the ACA is what really motivated them. But
I agree.
Yeah,
I think you're 100% correct that we do need to win that policy debate because you can't just rely on turnout. That's exactly what cost Democrats in 2016, obviously, but I would argue in 2014 because I remember this vividly in 2014, Democrats saying, we're all about turning out the vote. And we ended up with record low turnout that midterm election. That's right. So we do need to win that policy debate. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's the thing that I think the attention and those of us who are active in the campaigns for the people who won in our districts and in our state, we have to. This is when you double down on the pressure. This is when you say to your elected officials across the board at the state level, your state senator, state house, your mayor, if you want to politicize your mayorships, and of course then at the federal level, we have to double down on saying make an argument that people that currently don't agree with us in November of 2018 will have changed their mind and will agree with us in November of 2020. Like the entire point of winning the election is so that you can then have a chance to prove the point of your policy arguments. So now is when you kick into the mode for the next 23 and a half months. You kick in the mode to win the argument while you have control of the House at the federal level, and we have control of the House at the state level, and almost control of the Senate, or at least movable control of the Senate here in the state of Minnesota and the governorship. Now is the time you have to win the argument and not do precisely what Jason Lewis did and think that what happened in the election was all about the policy. Because what happened in this election was we all lost our minds watching the way that Donald Trump is destroying this country, and people said no to that. But it doesn't mean they were saying yes to the policies. And we have to get there on the policies and the prescriptions and all the rest of it. So, hey, we're going to be back here after the break. Mark, I see you're on hold, so hold on. We'll get to you after the break here on AM950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Hey, welcome back, AM950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Doug Padgett in here at 4:50, just for the 5 o'clock hour on this Monday, off to another week. And we started the day, the hour, talking about that today is Veterans Day. And for a lot of people, all that means is the post office is closed. And for other people that are in the military, it means a lot. It means that they have a day when more attention is drawn to the fact that a very small percentage of the people in this country are currently active in the military. And a smaller and shrinking number of people find themselves connected to it. But we have developed over the number of years a sense of appreciation and lore, a real shift from 40 years ago when those coming home from Vietnam were met with all kinds of hostility. So anyway, been a real shift in how we think about our veterans in this country. And I was reflecting on the fact that Armistice Day, which was the day that was meant to commemorate the end of war, was transferred or transitioned into being Veterans Day in 1954. And there's people who argue that shift changed the notion of cheering on the end of the military necessity into propagating it, keeping it going. And I would argue that we should have 2 days. We should have a day where you cheer on and commemorate and call for the end of war, should be a national holiday, and a day in which you honor the people who function as a part of our consistent war system, and that we put them in harm's way and ask them to do horrible and dangerous and damaging things to their bodies and to their psyches and to the world. So I think we should have 2 separate days and not have conflated the two of them together. So anyway, started out talking about that, and I saw that Mark was on. Mark, you've been holding on for a long time to talk about this. Hey, Mark, what are your thoughts on Veterans Day? Or Armistice Day?
Well, I've always thought, and I've tried to advocate for years, that we go back to Armistice Day, but it's physically impossible because of the intentional change is not a propagation, it's more to propagandize war. So it's actually more pro-war. And all of us as Americans should be beyond embarrassed. We should be pissed off at the behavior of the president over in Europe, who flew around the world and was afraid to go and expose his hair to the elements to go to an international memorial tribute to war veterans.
Yeah.
That was pathetic. Now, I also want to riff on a little bit what you were talking about earlier about, Eric Paulson, too. He just didn't lose. They got their butts kicked.
Yeah, right.
And it was interesting that for all of the Republican bluster, that there were a number of ballot initiatives in red states that passed minimum wage laws, passed health care laws, and passed gun reform laws in red states. But if we can go back to this, because there's an article in the paper today, and you would miss it if you weren't looking for it, and it has to do with what's going on with this Armistice versus Veterans Day argument.
Yeah.
And it states that top Obama officials, 30 of them, acknowledged their responsibility for initiating U.S. involvement in Yemen's destructive war and calling for the Trump administration to eliminate and halt America's role in this conflict, which means stop providing the technology, the assistance, and material support of this attack against Yemen civilians. Those constitute international war crimes. And that's so for this article to come out the day after Veterans Day is astonishing, because basically this is a confession by Obama officials. And again, if we're going to hold one side accountable, we need to hold our side accountable.
Absolutely. Yeah. The military complex, as it was referred to. What was it by Eisenhower that referred to it as the industrial?
Dwight Eisenhower, the military. That was his exit speech to the American people. You wear them, and then So let's talk about Vietnam
that's been both sides,
and what Springsteen was singing about. We were lied into that war as well.
Yep.
Who was held accountable? Who is being held accountable for the atrocities we've committed and participated in Yemen? Who's being accountable for the conspiracy theory about weapons of mass destruction and mushroom clouds? And these people are on TV every day shilling for more war. So we need to hold our own public and government officials responsible and stop this war export.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thanks, Mark. And I know we've talked about that before, because I think we've maybe even talked about it back on Mother's Day. You might know that Mother's Day was started as a response to their boys being sent to war. And so the original Mother's Day, late 1800s, was a mother's protest movement against war. So the reason there was a Mother's Day was to try to bring public pressure, first through mothers groups and then became religious groups, to try to stop the ongoing use of young men in war. And so then that got turned, of course, because World War I really brought an end to Mother's Day being about the end of war, because everybody had to rally. So that brought an end to it, and then Mother's Day became a day to honor the good work of mothers. And there's a thing that happens in anti-war movements where the point gets lost, and the characters that are wanting to be protected become the ones that we honor. So in other words, mothers were saying, please, this is hurting our boys and hurting our families. And we transitioned that into caring for mothers. And then Armistice Day, the people most benefited by not having war are the soldiers that have to go to war, what we would call veterans or the enlisted. So it was an act to try to protect people from having to go into the hell of war, and then we instead turned it into something to honor veterans. Now, I'm not having a conversation at this point to say should we or should we not be honoring veterans. I think we should, because we have a system that makes demands on people that we're unwilling to have the conversation about the necessity of war, and we just assume that we have to have a war machine to keep us safe. That is an assumption that exists in our society, and as long as that assumption exists, some people are going to pay a much higher price for having it. What I want to have in our society, and wish we could have, and people have tried to have it. They tried to have it in the late 1800s. They tried to have it at the end of World War I. They clearly tried to have it in the peace movements of the 50s and the peace movements of the early 70s. And I think we need another peace movement in our society today to try to make an argument that stopping the militarization and the reflex of violence and war is what we should get after. Now, this was something that Kennedy was going after when he wanted to have, the Peace Corps, wanted to have an equal sort of a level of attention given to our military corps and then to our Peace Corps. So anyway, these movements have been alive at different times, and it seems like the 100-year commemoration of the end of the war to end all wars, as it was hopefully characterized, clearly did not happen. So on this Veterans Day, thank you to anyone who's had to sacrifice and the families who sacrificed. But to all of us, may we pursue a kind of peace in this world where we won't say yes to war no more, as the old spiritual song would be sung. So AM950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Stick with us here over the evening. Lots of good things happen in our world, and we need to keep the pedal down on progressing toward them. All right, also there it was, the end of the radio show. That was a scattered one, but I thought a pretty good one today. Interesting, both the war commentary and what's happening with the presidency, and then how progressive people think. Scattered, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and going to be back on Wednesday with another edition of the show. So talk to you then.